Thank you all for being patient as we sorted these things out. And let me start by congratulating the organizers of the Marxist Education Project. It is not just that they had the longevity of 10 years, which is important and impressive in terms of keeping alive a Marxist left, but also the extremely high quality of the programming that the MEP has done over the years. It's a really significant contribution to left socialist and Marxist education, and they are to be commended and applauded, and I know we'll get a chance to talk about their accomplishments and their plans shortly. What I'm going to talk about is part of a larger study called Slavery and Capitalism, although I'll only be speaking to one aspect of that today. There's a larger project which will be published next year, a book by that title, Slavery and Capitalism, with University of California Press, and a version of what I'm talking to you about today will be out in the Review of Radical Political Economics late this year. But before I begin, I need to say that, particularly because I'm speaking about colonialism, but frankly, if I were speaking in any forum in this moment, I would have to say that the struggle to stop the genocide in Gaza and the struggle for a free Palestine is, as a number of people have said, the moral and political litmus test of this moment. And so if you remember nothing else from my presentation today, please remember the absolutely fundamental importance of the struggle for a free Palestine, an end to the genocide, and for the liberation of the Palestinian people. My presentation, as the subtitle suggests, starts at the end of Capital, which may seem odd, but it's because I want to talk about a journey that Marx didn't take at the end of the volume, Capital Volume 1, but which I want to suggest he, at some level, invites us to take. I think would be a more complete project had he done it, but I want to really work through that last chapter to demonstrate the ways in which, if we think it through, we begin to see the ways in which colonialism has to be central to Marx's account of the emergence of the capitalist mode of production as a global mode of production. And that's the key, of course, because Marx is clear from very, very early on in his writings, well before Capital, that capitalism implies a world market and a world system. And that's why the opposition he thinks of in terms of an international working class movement, a world revolutionary project, and so on. Now, when I was a student first studying Capital, some people said, well, you know, the last chapter is just a throwaway. The book really ends at the chapter before that, but Marx knew that the German censors read only the first few pages of a book and the last few pages. So he put this kind of tedious stuff about colonialism at the end. Now, there are all kinds of problems with that version of it, not least of which is that Marx completely, somewhat obsessively oversaw the French edition of Capital, which was never going to appear in front of the German censors, and he left that same chapter at the end. There's a clear sense in which Marx thought that the final chapter, which I'll describe to you in a moment, was the conclusion of Capital Volume 1. Now, let me say something about method and critical approach, because I'm looking at this chapter, I believe, in Marx's own critical spirit. And some of you will remember Marx's famous comment when asked about the publication of his collected works, where he said, well, first I would have to complete them. This was very late in his life, but as far as Marx was concerned, virtually everything he had written was unfinished. That's why he kept revising. There was a second German edition. If we look at the French edition of Capital, it's actually significantly revised over the first German edition, and so on. Marx was always reworking his critical analysis. And so we need to think about what he's doing as a critical research program, and one in which new results and new directions can continually be developed. I would suggest to you, for instance, that this is the spirit in which Marxist social reproduction theory has approached capital, by actually filling in an absence in his text. You'll recall, for instance, that Marx tells us at the very center of Volume 1 of Capital that the critical commodity, the key to the inner workings of the system, is human labor power. It is the commodification of human labor power that is the essence of capitalism. And yet, as Marxist feminist theorists have pointed out to us, Marx doesn't actually talk about the production and reproduction of that critical commodity, labor power. He just assumes that it's a backdrop to his story. And social reproduction feminist Marxists have said to us, no, we need to think about the labor processes that go into the production of human labor power, of living human beings, the reproduction of human life, and recognize that in order to grasp that, we need a more expansive concept of labor than simply wage labor. That there are all kinds of other human practical activities, to use what is often Marx's preferred term when talking about human praxis, human practical activity. There are all kinds of other human practical activities beyond those that are waged, that are essential for the reproduction of the system. And so it's in a similar spirit that I want to approach the final chapter of Capital, to talk about how might we fill in some absences in Marx's account in Capital. The chapter itself is entitled The Modern Theory of Colonialism. In and of itself, it's a not terribly engaging chapter title. It certainly doesn't have the drama of some of what has come before in his discussion of the primitive accumulation of capital. And the chapter raises implicitly the problem of, if you will, transplanting capitalist social relations from Europe to the colonies. This is the fundamental problem that's being raised there. And Marx's primary interlocutor is an English author and sometime colonial official named Edward Gibbon Wakefield. And Wakefield is somebody who's largely lost to most of us who work in political economy and the history of capitalism, not to people who do British colonialism. If you work on British colonialism, you'll know Wakefield. But otherwise, he's largely someone who's disappeared. And in his commentary, Marx begins with enormous irony. And some of you will know that Marx loves, he just relishes these opportunities to mock. When he gets a bourgeois commentator that he can ridicule, Marx is in his element. The text just comes alive with sarcasm, for instance. And Marx picks up on an account that Wakefield gives in one of his books about a colonial project in Australia, in the Swan River Colony. And it was a project in the 1830s led by Thomas Peel from Britain. And dreaming of colonial riches, Peel settled hundreds of poor settlers on 4 million acres of land in the Swan River Colony. Okay, so all the way from Britain he comes with his hundreds of laborers. He's taking over these 4 million acres of land. And alas, the operation fell flat on its face. the hundreds of laborers that Peel brought with him ran away. They headed off into the outback where they could squat, took over land and started farming and producing for themselves, hunting, planting crops, and so on. And you know that Marx is going to have fun with this episode, so I'm going to quote you the 3 sentences that he devotes to this. A Mr. Peel, Wakefield complains, took with him from England to the Swan River district of Western Australia means of subsistence and of production to the amount of £50,000. This Mr. Peel even had the foresight to bring with him 3,000 persons of the working class, men, women, and children. Once he arrived at his destination, quote from Wakefield, Mr. Peel was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river, unquote. Unhappy Mr. Peel, who provided for everything except the export of English relations of production to Swan River, end quote. So Marx is clearly having a great time with this story. And after a bit more fun with it, Marx turns to his main theoretical point, which is to explain that as long as laboring people can find land to work for themselves, they will avoid wage labor. Now, having spent a lot of years working as a historian, I don't make many trans-historical kinds of generalizations, but I will say to you that that is one of those generalizations which seems to me to be cross-historically valid. If laboring people, if poor people have land to produce means of subsistence for themselves, they will tend to avoid the coercions and the disciplines of wage labor for others. And that's what Marx is using the Mr. Peel story to illustrate. There was land that could be seized. Now, Marx leaves something out of the account, and it's something that barely enters into his discussion of primitive accumulation of capital, and it's an omission that a lot of scholars of settler colonialism have been correcting for some time, which is that he avoids the expropriation of indigenous peoples. The fact that there were lands to be squatted on has to do in much of the colonial world with the fact that indigenous people were either dispossessed and marginalized or eliminated. And that part of the story of primitive accumulation, a number of scholars have started to really address, particularly those working with settler colonial theory. But in other words, if land, the most vital means of production, is available to poor people, they will, as Marx puts it, vanish from the labor market. Okay? And as Marx further puts it, they'll reappear as an independent peasant working for themselves. Okay? Small farmers, poor peasants, whatever it might be. This is why our poor Mr. Peel was, quote, left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river. And then Marx can't resist poking a little more fun. After all, this is too good a story not to milk for everything that it's worth. He concludes about the unhappy Mr. Peel, quote, think of the horror. The excellent capitalist has imported bodily from Europe with his own good money his own competitors, because they've now set up production for themselves. The end of the world has come, exclamation mark, end of quote. Now, Marx loves stories like this. In the Grundrisse, he tells a similar story about emancipation in the West Indies and the problem that the London Times was so preoccupied with and so troubled about, which was that, quote, the free blacks of Jamaica content themselves with producing only what is necessary for their own consumption. And so the Times of London was full of stories about the problem of, quote unquote, loafing among emancipated Jamaicans. They weren't interested in entering the labor market. They weren't drawn into circuits of commodity production and exchange. And Marx, again, with a lot of humor, summarizes this story in the Grundrisse as saying, they have ceased to be slaves, but not in order to become wage laborers. Right? And this is the dilemma in the colonies. Right? Marx is aware of this. He's thinking about it. He refers to this episode from Jamaica of emancipated black laborers setting up to produce for themselves and not entering into wage labor or commodity production. He refers to this episode as, quote, delightful, unquote. And as I say, you can see the humor in it. But for Marx, the point of this story is ultimately to turn back to Europe. He enters the colonial terrain to point out to us that capitalist production relations couldn't take hold in the Swan River colony because there was land available to the direct producers. Therefore, this gives us the secret to the emergence of capitalist social relations, that the direct producers must be dispossessed of means of production of their own, most especially land. It is dispossession which is the key to proletarianization. It is dispossession of millions of people which is required to generate a working class engaged in wage labor. And of course, that's the fundamental story of Part 8 of Capital Volume 1, and it's a revolutionary insight. It allows Marx to show us that capital is not a thing but a social relation, and a social relation that pivots on the expropriation of the direct producers from the soil, from the land. But that account fails as a comprehensive account of global capitalism. It's a very powerful account of the emergence of capitalism in England. And Marx recognizes that he's using the colonies to illustrate the distinctiveness of what's happened in Europe. But I want to ask the question for our purposes of what if Marx had stayed with the logic of the Wakefield argument? What if he'd thought about what this meant for the globalization of capitalist social relations? Marx ultimately intended a book on the world market. And I believe had he ever had his whole 6-book plan for capital completed, he would have had to return to this problem. But because he was explaining the historical specificity of capitalism and its emergence in Britain, he didn't have to go there at that point. Because however abject a failure Mr. Peel's colony was in the Swan River of Australia, many colonial projects were not a failure. After all, for a couple of hundred years, the world's sugar, cotton, much of its rice, much of its coffee, all were being produced in New World colonies. They weren't all an abject failure, unlike Mr. Peel. And again, Marx knows this, but in this final chapter of Capital Volume 1, he's not pursuing it in any kind of systematic fashion. So let's go back to Marx's insight. And in a moment, I'll come back to Wakefield and why Edward Gibbon Wakefield becomes Marx's key interlocutor in this section at the conclusion of Capital Volume 1. But it's important to note that Wakefield was not the first to recognize the problem. There was a long-standing colonial literature on it. I'll give you one example. Alexander MacDonald in Considerations on Negro Slavery, 1824. MacDonald had spent 5 years in the British colony of Demerara, which had first been a Dutch colony, then taken over by the British, and then he worked for a pro-slavery lobby group in London called the Committee of West Indian Merchants. All right, so this is a polemicist for Atlantic slavery, McDonald. But he's writing, 1824 is his book, he's writing at a time when abolitionism is growing. Britain has already abolished English involvement in the slave trade in 1807. It's only a matter of years away from the abolition of slavery in the British colonial world. And so with abolition growing, and with the principles of liberal political economy coming to the forefront intellectually in Britain, MacDonald starts to develop his defense in his book. And he said, okay. Are we good? Okay. Okay. So MacDonald is struggling with this problem, and he says that the reason that freed people don't go into the labor market is because of the abundance of food in the West Indies. Where food is abundant, they're under no obligation to sell their labor power. And as if channeling Marx, MacDonald claims that people will not work for others, quote, without compulsion, unquote. And then he says to us, but that compulsion can be of two kinds. First, the coercion of a master, slavery. Secondly, the dread of starvation. So you need one or the other. And the problem is with abundant food, you can't get the latter. All right? You can't get the dread of starvation. So put differently, the coercion of propertylessness, of being dispossessed, doesn't exist in the West Indies. Now, what Wakefield does is simply add to this existing colonial project the idea that, well, food is only in abundance if you have the land to get it from. Because if all land is enclosed and privatized, it doesn't matter if the food is abundant. You have no access to it. So Wakefield recognizes that it's not food per se, it's access to land on which food can be grown. That is the issue. And so for Wakefield, it becomes the problem of the, quote, superabundance, unquote, of land. Now, like MacDonald, Wakefield recognizes that slavery is the obvious solution. And he says there would have been no development of the U.S. South without slavery, for instance. In that respect, he just agrees with what the slaveocracy, the planter class, had been saying for 200 years, that you need slavery to produce goods in the U.S. South. And this is because the fundamental challenge for every colonialist in the New World, the fundamental problem, as he puts it, is, quote, they want labor which shall be constant. And note the word constant, okay? If there was one overriding problem for capitalists in the New World, it was that free laborers were inconstant because land was cheap. Again, land was cheap because of indigenous dispossession. Okay, that's always the backdrop. The violence of indigenous dispossession is the backdrop to this story. But where it has taken place on a massive scale and land is cheap, then the workers who go into the labor market do so as a secondary undertaking, only when they're starved for cash that they need. If it's time to work their crops, they leave. They leave the places of wage labor. So labor is inconstant. And as a result, Wakefield says, well, look, there's one solution to this, which we know, and that's convict labor. Right? And those of you who know a little bit about Australia will know that convict labor was extremely important in the early going in the history of Australia. But the numbers aren't great enough. He looks at the British penal system and he says they can't possibly generate enough convicts for us to use for forced labor in the New World. Okay? And so this is the heart of the problem that the so-called modern theory of colonialism is designed to address. Now, this issue is recognized, but I would argue underexplained and under-theorized by a variety of historians. So Eric Williams, for example, in his book Capitalism and Slavery, it's a very difficult, complicated, and controversial book with some quite striking insights and I would argue some real errors embodied in it. But he argues in Capitalism and Slavery, other things being equal, in the early stages of colonial development, when slavery is adopted, it is not adopted as the choice over free labor. There is no choice. In other words, sure, they might want free labor in principle, they might prefer it, but there's no choice. It's not there. It's not available, or it is so incredibly inconstant as to be completely unreliable. This is, if you want to think about it in these terms, it's a form of capitalist precarity because the availability of labor power is precarious. It can't be guaranteed. It is not secure. Sidney Mintz put it slightly differently. Quote, since such a labor force would not materialize freely, in quotes, it would have to be dragooned. And fundamentally, the colonial labor question is what mode of dragooning labor will be required to make it happen. Now, for Wakefield, he had a fundamental problem. He's writing in the 1830s, and abolition is either just about to happen or, in terms of some of his middle and later works, has already happened. So if chattel slavery is disappearing, how are you going to guarantee a constant labor force? And Wakefield's argument was the colonies will have to artificially raise the price of land. There's no other way of doing it. You've got to eliminate cheap land. And so colonial policy will have to artificially elevate land prices. And what this means is that labor will be constant for the 3 or 5 or how many years required for the average laborer to save enough to buy their own land. And so long as you've got a steady flow of immigration into a relatively expensive land market, they'll be forced to engage in wage labor constantly for at least some years. Now, by the way, this rarely worked. When they tried it in Canada, for example, Wakefield had a major influence in Canada, the laborers just fled south of the border into the United States. They kept heading where land was cheaper. So it was very, very difficult to do because you would have had to have a globally coordinated colonial policy to make this happen. And given the rivalry between the United States and Great Britain over Canada, for instance, this was not going to happen. But Wakefield's solution was in the spirit of industrial capitalism. It was in the spirit of using so-called free wage labor, but having to create artificial market conditions. You couldn't use free markets to create so-called free labor. You had to use artificially restricted land markets to make it possible. And this is why some people say, I think correctly, that Wakefield laid out a vision for a middle-class empire. It was an empire which broke with all the older aristocratic and Tory commitments to slave labor as part of the colonial system. So, as I say, Marx then turns back to Europe with this insight. But staying with the colonial problem for a moment, we can see, okay, if you're going to have some degree of success, you're going to, with a colonial capitalism, you're going to, as Sidney Mintz said, have to dragoon labor. And as many of you know, initially the first wave of attempts is primarily in the northern part of the Americas to dragoon indentured European labor. Mexico and south, there's an enormous amount of dragooning of indigenous labor. Millions of enslaved indigenous people, but not as much north of Mexico. So that if we look, for instance, at British America between 1580 and 1775, so nearly 200 years, there were at least 350,000 white servants, quote unquote, dragooned to the New World. These were indentured laborers. They were bound to a single employer. Could they be bought and sold? Yes. They were, as Edward Morgan and other American historians put it, they were put up in card games. People could win and lose an indentured laborer in a card game. But their bondage was temporary. They were not permanent chattel. So indentured labor is a form of bondage, a bonded laborer, but it's not chattel, because the human being is not being permanently sold. But nevertheless, if you look at that period that I mentioned, up till 1775, this is about 2/3 of all European settlers to the Americas come as indentured laborers. Okay? Most poor people couldn't even pay for their transatlantic voyage. So they took it as a debt that would be paid off by their employer who held their contract of indenture for 3, 5, or 7 years. Okay? So it's a form of debt bondage that generates an indentured labor relationship. The problem is that over time, indentured labor declines, partly because after the civil wars in England, as the economy enters into an upswing, wages rise in England, and fewer paupers and poor workers are as interested in emigrating to deal with indentureship when there are higher wages finally available in England. And so beginning in about 1660 in Barbados, somewhat later in Virginia, South Carolina, there's a massive turn to enslaved African labor for purposes of colonial commodity production. So chattel slavery becomes the primary solution to the problem of constant labor. And you get it like just beautifully put in a passage in 1760 from Benjamin Franklin, who conceded that colonists bought enslaved Africans, quote, because slaves may be kept as long as a man pleases or has occasion for their labor, while hired men are continually leaving their master. All right? That's the problem of labor turnover. If we look at the northeastern US in this period, for example, worker turnover rates were routinely 100% a year. In other words, over the course of the year, every worker would leave. These were the routine turnover rates. Now, most of you will know turnover rates in modern capitalism are dramatically lower than this. Even during the so-called Great Resignation, they're significantly lower. But the point is, many of these people were simply leaving to set up for themselves on the land. A couple of nice little examples to illustrate the point. In 1829, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company imported 500 indentured servants from England. These, any of you who know the history of canal building, well, this is brutal work. The mortality rates are massive. they all ran off. Like literally within a matter of weeks, all these indentured laborers just disappeared. 20 years later, the Cape Fear Navigation Company of North Carolina brought over 180 German and Hungarian workers, once again, to build canals. They all took off. Okay? And so this is why we see, particularly across the US South, chattel labor being used increasingly for canal building, but also in industrial production throughout the South, in iron making, lumbering, mining, rope making, tobacco processing. As a number of historians have pointed out, there were probably something in the neighborhood of 200,000 enslaved workers doing industrial, factory, or mining work in the US South. It's true we refer to it as a plantation system, and overwhelmingly it was, but it was also the solution to industrial factory production in large pockets of the South for all of these reasons. Now, and part of the argument that I develop in this forthcoming book on slavery and capitalism is that in buying a human laborer, in buying an enslaved laborer, what employers were buying, what they were purchasing, was guaranteed access to labor power. And the word guaranteed is critical. Once you've got mass dispossession from the land, enclosure, privatization of land stocks, as had happened in England through the enclosure movement over 300 years, once you've got that, then you can get a constant labor supply because there are millions of people with no other means of survival except wage labor. But outside of that, the problem of inconstancy of labor, the precariousness of the labor supply, means that you need some form of binding labor to capital, of binding labor to employers. And so indentured service for a period of years was one mechanism, but as it declined, then full-fledged chattel slavery became the dominant form in the Americas. As chattel slavery comes under attack, indentured labor takes off again, particularly in the Caribbean. It's why the so-called coolie system comes in the middle of the 19th century. Bonded, particularly Indian and Chinese laborers, coming into the Caribbean to work on sugar plantations and so on from about the 1850s onward. So that Cuba, for example, in the middle of the 19th century, has 125,000 indentured Asian laborers working alongside enslaved laborers. They're working alongside because the supply of African enslaved people is dwindling. And so they're now supplementing slavery with Asian indentured labor. But we need to remember that none of this looks like the mythology of the so-called free labor market. And this is something that I'll come back to in a moment. So these workers from China in Cuba, but the same story can be told in other parts of the Caribbean. It can be told in Louisiana. It can be told in California. These indentured workers, they were wage earners. So technically they're free wage earners. But their 8-year contracts could be bought and sold. They worked under armed drivers in the field, just as chattel laborers had. They could not exit employment. They could not voluntarily leave. They were routinely whipped, and they couldn't even leave the estate without written consent, without a pass. Okay? And yet, people who fetishize the idea that everything that's not chattel is free labor often really struggle to come to terms with all the degrees of bondage that actually affected the legal freedoms of ostensible free wage laborers. As one historian puts it, quote, "It was an odd form of wage labor indeed, in which the worker had almost the same effective legal status as a slave. Now, it shouldn't surprise us. And I don't think it would have surprised Marx. It's just that Marx, I don't think, fetishized the legal relation in the same way that some historians later came to do. Because we happen to know that the Master and Servant Acts in effect in England at the very time Marx was writing Volume 1 of Capital, they criminalized voluntarily leaving your job. And while Marx is writing Capital, there were hundreds and sometimes more than 1,000 prosecutions of workers for leaving their jobs voluntarily. You could only leave after the time of a contract. Now, we know that today, legally, there's supposed to be no inhibition, no restriction on taking and leaving work. But the point is that legal freedom within the labor market didn't exist in England in Marx's day, which is one of the reasons I would suggest that throughout Capital, Marx increasingly puts the word free in quotes when referring to the free laborer. All right? He's ironizing the freedom of the wage laborer, and by the end, he's calling it a form of economic despotism. By the way, I've been speaking primarily about the Atlantic world and Australia, but the same set of issues existed for the British Empire in other regions. It's why in India, on cotton and tea plantations, they use the indentured labor system very, very widely. And in fact, it's quite interesting to read there what colonial officials are saying, the ones responsible for the British officials responsible for the colonization of India, because they repeatedly mock the liberal political economists. They think these people need to get their heads out of some unfortunate place because they have no idea what's really going on in the colonies. So that the Secretary of State for India in the middle of the 19th century, Charles Wood, mocked the so-called Manchester people. The Manchester people are the classical political economists. And he mocked them because the problem was that demand for labor power was not met with any supply. You could want wage labor as much as you were willing to pay for it, and so on. It didn't mean it would automatically materialize on the market for all the reasons that Wakefield understood and that Marx was emphasizing. Indian peasants have their own land. If you don't dispossess the peasantry, why are they going to enter the wage labor market? And so the Economist, for example, writing about India and the colonial problems in India, The Economist magazine writes that in India there were, quote, very particular difficulties that obstructed the primary motives upon which political economy depends. Now, the primary motives upon which political economy depends are the dread of starvation. That is the primary motive. And having not created the conditions for the dread of starvation, they couldn't find themselves wage labor. Or put differently, possessing land of their own, Indian cultivators refused to behave like, quote, rational market actors, unquote. Okay? They did that irrational thing of actually working their own land, feeding themselves, and not having to work under the coercion and discipline of somebody else. All right? That's fundamentally the issue. So that is why, in the colonial context, bonded labor becomes the secret for the globalization of capitalism. And as a result, I'm suggesting to you that had Marx not taken Wakefield's turn back and look at England, but had he said to us, what questions does this raise for thinking about the colonial globalization of capitalism, he would have had to center bonded labor and slavery in a way in which he doesn't in Capital. Now, just to cheat a little bit, I will also say to you that I don't think Marx would have been shocked by what I'm saying. even though I think a lot of ostensible Marxists would be and are. That is to say, the position that goes capitalism equals wage labor, capitalism equals free labor, and sort of takes that as a static definition with no historical contextualization and just applies it formulaically to the world, has problems with this. But actually, if you look at Marx's comments on slavery, particularly in the US South, which he knows best, Marx doesn't know the Caribbean terribly well. He picks up what the Times is saying about Jamaica, for instance. Marx knew the US and the US South very well. He was, after all, a correspondent for a newspaper in Vienna and in New York all throughout the Civil War. We still have all kinds of untranslated writing that Marx did on the Civil War in the United States. Moreover, he's in regular correspondence with German exiles from the 1848 revolution in Germany who came to the US. Many of them, as we now know, who became abolitionists and radical Republicans and served in officer positions in the Union Army, particularly Marx's dear friend Joseph Vedermeyer. All right, so Marx is in very close contact with what's going on in the US. And if you read what he says in Capital and Other Places, it's quite illuminating. So I'm just going to point out to you, for example, that in Volume 1 of Capital, he tells us that slavery in the US South is no longer the patriarchal form of slavery. It is instead a commodity-producing form. And he says, based on, quote, the production of surplus value itself, end quote. Right? So that's Volume 1 of Capital. All right? The slavery we see in the US South today is commodity production based on the production of surplus value. In the third volume of Capital, he comes to the problem of, he's talking about the price of land. It's a big, big issue for Marx for obvious reasons, figuring out what creates the price of land in the capitalist mode of production. But then he segues into what determines the price of an enslaved person. And he says to us that the price of a slave in the South, quote, is no more than the anticipated and capitalized surplus value or profit that is to be extracted from them. Okay? Price is based on the fact that they produce surplus value. You capitalize that as if it's an asset to be bought in advance. It's like buying any asset that returns an income over time. And you can, quote, capitalize it and turn it into an asset, just like a stock, for instance, or a piece of land, or in this case, an enslaved person. But notice that it's the anticipated and capitalized surplus value, the form that surplus product takes in the capitalist mode of production. And the key here is that these bonded people are producing commodities in a system dominated by the law of value. You need to produce according to socially necessary labor times in order to hold your own in the market, subjected to imperatives to improve labor productivity in order to survive global competition. It seems to me that had Marx ever gotten to that book that I mentioned earlier on the world market, he would have had to centrally come back to this issue. So I'll remind you of something that he wrote in the 1840s. It comes from the text known as The Poverty of Philosophy. He says, quote, "It is slavery that gave the colonies their value. It is the colonies that created world trade, and it is world trade that is the precondition of large-scale industry." In other words, colonies, slavery, world market. The final chapter of Capital Volume 1 takes us to the threshold of that issue. Marx then turned his attention back to Europe to say, see, if you haven't dispossessed people of land, you can't get classical capitalist relations. based on wage labor. But he didn't ask the question, since they found an alternative strategy for commodity production in the colonies based on bonded labor, how does that affect our understanding of capitalism and its global history? So I really want to suggest that by treating the last chapter of Capital Volume 1 as not as the end of the story, but as I put it in the subtitle, the beginning of a journey, we can start to imagine how to fill in a story that Marx didn't write and didn't give us, but it allows us to create a much more multidimensional account of the global history of capitalism, and it's one that reinstates the centrality of extra economic coercion in the construction of capitalist relations, and it recenters bondage, slavery, colonialism, and racism at the heart of, not as marginal elements to the history of capitalism as a world system. So I hope I've provoked you in some ways, and I look forward to your questions, your comments, and the discussion. Thank you. All right, why don't I take those three, and I'm sure that may lead to others. So, Fred, on the general question, my feeling is that there is no theory of racialization in Marx. And I'm not saying he doesn't recognize forms of racial discrimination. He recognizes two in particular that really run through his writings. The racialized attitudes of the English towards the Irish, and the racial division between white and black, particularly in the US South. So it's not that he doesn't recognize racial oppressions and forms of inequality, but Marx's overriding optimism about the growing organization of the working class leads him, in historical retrospect, to underestimate the challenges of solidarity. I think there's understandable reasons for this. If you look at the two cases I've mentioned, he looks at the British working class movement of the Chartists in particular, the most important mass working class movement in Britain in the first half of the 19th century. Mass movement. And he looks at it and he goes, the leadership is disproportionately Irish. English workers are accepting the leadership of their Irish co-workers. And later, after the collapse of Chartism, then he begins to say things like, actually there is this fundamental problem because antagonism towards the Irish now binds the English worker to his rulers. By the 1860s, he's recognizing that dynamic, which is a version of what W.E.B. Du Bois is going to say to us later about the so-called wages of whiteness. Mm-hmm. You may be getting super exploited, but the social benefit of being constructed as white in public space before the law and so on is a wage of whiteness that can bind you to the system. So Marx has insights about it, but he believes, and he's again not wrong in the first instance, he believes that the destruction of the Confederacy and the slaveocracy in the Civil War in the United States is going to produce a multiracial working class upsurge. He's not entirely wrong about that. There's both black Reconstruction and the great wave of strikes of the 1870s. So he tends to think that the solidarities forged in struggle are going to create cross-racial class solidarities, which will essentially resolve the problem of racial conflict inside working class movements. We now know it's much more complicated. And it's why, I think still people underestimate Frantz Fanon's engagement with Marxism. partly because of some of the post-colonial constructions of Fanon. But Fanon says to us very, very early on in The Wretched of the Earth, Marxism needs to be stretched in the colonial context. He does not say abandoned. He does not say we need a different theory and practice, but there's a stretching operation that's required in the colonial context. And it's that operation we don't get from Marx, so we need to turn to very, very rich histories of anti-colonial Marxism in order to recuperate and develop, I believe, some of the most important insights. And that really takes me into both of the questions that come to gender. I try to do this justice in the text I've got on slavery and capitalism. But honestly, Hester, in terms of your question, one cannot do an analysis of slavery and capitalism without a central gender analysis. Just consider the following and nothing more. First, the status of slave or free descended from the womb. In law, it descended from the womb. It was birth. It was your mother who determined your racial status. Okay? In other words, born of a black body, you were enslaved. And that was the fundamental principle of slave law, not just in the United States, throughout the Caribbean, and so on. So, in other words, enslavement is matrilineal. Okay? So it's fundamentally gendered from the inception. Paternity does not count in this area. Very, very interesting within a patriarchal system, isn't it?
System of rape.
Exactly. Exactly. Secondly, of course, when you look, particularly by the 19th century in the US, because remember, the US is the primary site where the enslaved population grew by so-called natural increase, not simply by new imports. In other words, in most New World slave societies, the population had a negative natural growth rate. Without fresh imports of enslaved people, the population would decline. Not the US South. All kinds of reasons for it. But the most important was that, quote unquote, breeding became understood as part of an investment strategy. Enslaved children as offspring were commercial assets. And as a result, we're now getting not simply descent from the womb, but the commodification of the womb. Right? And so these are pillars of how the Atlantic slave system operates, and most dramatically so in the US. So it's crucial. This is where you have to have a social reproduction analysis. And I would say, by the way, that the historian Jennifer Morgan's work on this is really, really important and valuable. Both of Jennifer Morgan's books are really crucial in this area. And Carol, absolutely right on the point you raise about migrant labor. And I'm going to take the opportunity, partly because Sue Ferguson is in the room and partly because we get to do a plug. Sue Ferguson and I wrote a piece in the Socialist Register in 2015 called Precarious Migrants, in which we essentially argued that the migrant labor regime is the most important contemporary form of bonded labor within the circuits of global capitalism for all of the reasons you were describing. The lack of citizenship rights and full legal freedoms, particularly the inability to leave an employer of your own consent and find another place of work. That is a form of being bound to an employer. And most domestic labor regimes and farm worker regimes and so on, farm labor regimes, all impose this inability to freely withdraw from an employment relation. And these have become incredibly important to contemporary capitalism. And one of the ways that we argue it in Precarious Migrants in the Socialist Register is to say, look, people misunderstand what the border regime means for capital. Not for Trump or not for Greg Abbott, but what the border regime means for capital. Capital wants the flow of migrant labor across the borders, but it wants it to remain precarious. In other words, it doesn't want full legalization. Okay? If you have legally constrained labor power being pulled in, this is hugely advantageous in terms of the right to unionize, the right to strike, the right to exit employment, and so on and so forth. And it's why the chambers of commerce, for instance, across the United States never say close the border. That's not their position, to close the border. But do they want that labor power constrained, curtailed, surveyed, policed, and insecure? Absolutely, 100%. And so you get those flows of labor. Two further things about that and the reproduction of labor power. One is that, of course, all of the domestic workers who are coming in, the Canadian program is the one I know the best, and you wouldn't believe the number of the amount of gendered labor power being pulled in from the Philippines, for instance, into the Canadian market to do basically indentured domestic labor. So that is part of the reproduction of future labor power that's happening, say, in North America. It's not simply parents who are doing it. There are waged workers in public institutions like schools, hospitals, daycare centers, both public and private, who are contributing to it. But there are also in-home laborers, hired, who are contributing to the reproduction of labor power in the global north. But then the other thing is, for all kinds of economies, the remittances that those workers send back are critical to the reproduction of the household and the next generation in the country of origin, whether it's the Philippines or El Salvador, and so on. So it's working at two levels of the reproduction of labor power, both in the so-called host country and in the country of origin. These are very complex ways in which flows of labor power, remittances of wages, and so on are reproducing a global working class, but also creating these both racialized and gender differentiations within that global working class. So I think it remains, the question of work around global labor migration and the rights of migrant workers remains central to this sort of axis of gender and racial oppression that's running through global capitalism today. I'm going to take the first and the third together because they're on intersecting themes, and then come back to the semi-proletarian populations. So what I'm trying to argue about chattel slavery is that the enslaved person is not simply a capital asset. They are formally, and especially for accounting purposes, a capital asset. But in fact, they're living laborers. And Marx is clear, I think, that they are living laborers. In fact, at one point in the Grundrisse, he describes the enslaved person as a, quote, living labor machine. But notice the emphasis on living labor. I think it's critical because it means that they are not simply a capital asset. Yes, they can be bought and sold like a capital asset, but they are not constant capital. Marx's fundamental distinction between the two forms of capital are constant and variable. Constant capital cannot produce a surplus value. variable capital does. And variable capital does for two reasons. First, its costs of reproduction need not be equal to the value it produces. In other words, there's a variation between what it costs to employ them and what they produce. And that variation is the surplus value. But secondly, they're variable capital because they struggle over the rate of exploitation. The rate of exploitation is a variable because they have human will. And one of the things I try to show at great length in the book manuscript that's coming next year is that we have dramatically underestimated workplace conflict and outright strikes by enslaved people throughout the New World. We know the dramatic examples like the Jamaican general strike of slaves in 1831. We know that because it's in the history books. We need to take more seriously W.E.B. Du Bois's claim for a general strike of the slaves during the Civil War. But I argue that at much smaller micro levels, workplace conflict is a constant among enslaved people. They are slowing down, deliberately breaking tools. They are running off. You see episodes of 40 of them running off together, for instance, and sending an envoy who says, "We will return only on the following conditions." And those conditions can be the removal of an overseer, that Mary is taken out of the fields because she's pregnant, that we get those extra hours off on Saturday that we used to get in addition to Sunday. And by the way, the struggle over labor time is also recurrent throughout New World slavery. They win. In places like Martinique, by the 1840s, they won a second full day off from labor in the fields, and they won it through pitched battles. And that's part of it being variable capital. It's variable because human laborers resist, fight back, organize. They introduce variation into their degree of exploitation. Constant capital, machines, barns, hoes, and so on, don't resist like this. And so my argument is that they can be bought and sold as a capital asset, but they are in fact living labor. And as a result, they're also producers of surplus value, like all living laborers who produce commodities for capital. There's an appropriation of surplus value that's happening. And so Marilyn, on your question, if they produce surplus value, all Marx is saying to us here really is this. Look, when I buy a piece of land as a landlord, I'm buying it because I know that that land currently gets the following rent annually. So I buy that building or that piece of land. And all I do is I, quote, capitalize by, as Marx says, and I anticipate how much that rent will be over, say, 20 years. That rent times 20 becomes a capital value. So I buy the building based on the annual rent. I buy the land based on the annual rent. And you project forward for a certain lifespan. For all kinds of reasons, economists like to use 20 years, and I won't get into whether that's good or not. We'll just use that assumption. If I know that the average peak productivity of an enslaved laborer is 20 years, I can do exactly the same thing. I can look at the current level of profit or surplus value annually from a healthy enslaved person. And then I can project a price based on a 20-year cycle. Okay? So as Marx says, I'm anticipating that they'll live for 20 years and be a productive laborer for 20 years. So it's an anticipation, and it's a capitalization in the sense in which I'm paying for it all up front on the assumption that I actually make more over that 20-year cycle than I paid. And that I make a certain, 5% annually, 10% annually. So it's the anticipation that this laborer will produce. And what we know is that you could go to slave sellers' catalogs and you would get prices for children, women, older men, and so on, as a percentage of a, quote, prime hand. So you take a field hand in the prime of life, you calculate a price, and then you say, a 10-year-old child is worth 3/4 of that. Because they're really close to field work, but they're still maybe a year or two away from that, and it might be not till they're 13 or 14 that they can reach the output of a full-bodied adult. Okay? So they literally had calculations of, quote, capitalizing them as assets with prices. So the whole price system is what Marx is thinking about. And Marx is really saying to us, what are they buying? And in the case of someone who buys land or a building, we know they're buying future rent. And Marx is saying to us, in the case of an enslaved person, they're buying future surplus value. That's the difference. It's not rent of land, it's surplus value from living labor. And so we're turning it into a commodity, but there's an anticipation. If that enslaved person dies tomorrow, they've lost their investment. If they run off, they've lost their investment, and so on. But it's that notion that we need to think about them as living laborers who will produce future streams of revenue. That means they can have a capital asset in the here and now, but still be living labor.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
And just one very short comment, which is that, to go back to your point about social reproduction, that the capacity of enslaved women for childbearing is part of the advertisements, right? She is a good breeder.
Absolutely.
Right, so it's the reproductive capacity of women that becomes part of what the price is, right? So it's literally the purchasing of future enslaved human beings as part of the value of the labor power of that enslaved woman.
Yes.
Very small.
And by the way, just a quick pursuit on that one. They start to use all this coded language that every buyer knows. So a young woman who they see as likely to be a big breeder is, quote unquote, fancy. Okay, and so that adjective, fancy, is put into the ads. Okay, she's attractive, likely to be sexually active, therefore a big breeder. And you're right, it's marketed as an attribute.
I'm interested in a situation where within colonialism where the two systems may have existed side by side. I believe that that there were only a minority of white farmers in the South owned slaves. The majority did not, so they farmed on their own. And yet, the book Empire of Cotton, whose author's name escapes me at the moment.
Sven Beckert.
Sorry?
Sven Beckert.
Beckert, right, yeah. He says that the systems are incompatible. The slavery system and the free wage system are incompatible, which is why you have the production of cotton in one place and the manufacture someplace else. And I just wondered, what light you can throw on that about the social relations. If they did exist side by side, what were the social relations between the two?
Yeah. And Stuart, do you want to?
I was just going to say, I've forgotten what contemporary author points out, that abortion was strictly prohibited under slavery because you were destroying an asset. And then if you look at the map where abortion is now banned, it's the Confederacy plus.
And, one of the things that's been very, very good, I haven't forgotten, but I'll just stay on this point for a moment. One of the things that's been very good about a lot of the feminist scholarship in this area in recent years has been to recognize the degree of both birth control and abortion, usually based on herbal plant medicines, that were used by women of African descent in the Americas. So that they were actually trying to regulate their reproduction in significant ways. But yes, criminal offense because you are stealing future property from the slave owner by controlling reproduction. And yeah, I know.
Actually, I'd like to quickly follow up
Sure.
on that. Was this used often as a result of being impregnated by a white person?
It certainly happens for that reason, but it seems also clear, you know, there's reason to think that while it was not widespread, by which I mean the evidence is overwhelming that enslaved people actually formed tight kinship groups and reconstructed their own family forms. They were more porous and flexible and fluid family forms, generally speaking, but they did construct nucleated family forms, often multi-generational, and so on. But nonetheless, the scenario that Toni Morrison lays out in Beloved happened. The idea that you did not want to birth a child who would know enslavement. And that, you know, to a small degree infanticide, but more significantly abortion was used for that reason, as well as in cases of rape. No doubt about that. But also sometimes just the idea that I don't want to bring this upon my offspring. Yeah, on this question of the incompatibility, you know, I often really try to work through what are people trying to say? Because you're right. If you take the 200,000 workers in industry in the South, chattel workers in industry, they were normally in factories and mines with white wage laborers as well. There was usually a so-called skill differential. The more skilled and therefore better paid positions went to the white laborers, and the most menial, hardest labor went to chattel laborers. But nevertheless, there's interaction. I mean, I don't see how we deny that. And that interaction sometimes involves social bonding in important ways. And, you know, we need to remember that, too. In 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup essentially is able to tell his story to a white carpenter, right? And that carpenter is the one who finally tracks down the evidence that this was a man born legally free in the U.S. North who was simply kidnapped and sold 12 years into slavery. So those social interactions are happening as well. So yeah, I'm always curious. The other thing is, I think one of the reasons that people counterpose them the way you've described is that they underestimate the wage payments within slavery. And people struggle with this, and yet the evidence shows overwhelmingly, and it goes back to my point about the investment in enslaved people being a form of variable capital. If you worked on Sunday, you generally got paid. Because Sunday was enslaved people's time away from the field. If you did chores, you were usually paid in money or in kind.
Weren't there some states that had laws requiring?
There were.
Yeah,
there were. And it became constitutionalized, particularly in the French colonies after a wave of enslaved rebellions. The Saturday and Sunday off were written into law, and you had to pay. And you could basically go, enslaved people could go to a colonial official and file a formal complaint if they weren't paid for those days, for instance. So we tend to underestimate that wage payment is also a part of the chattel experience. And so really what's happening is that enslaved people are seeing that huge amount of their labor isn't being recompensed with wages, while the white workers, the carpenters on the plantation, the skilled workers in the mine, and so on were. So, and you know, one of the things which I find very, very interesting is when Marx says that the Civil War involves a clash of two social systems, he never says slavery and capitalism. He says slave labor and free labor. And if you read his journalism, what he's actually saying to us is that it is the working class of the North that despises slavery. It's the working class of the North that fears that if the South wins, they'll be driven down. Now, that could coexist, by the way. That sentiment of hating the South could coexist. Okay, anyway, I'll just finish this point quickly. Marx is talking about that a fundamental tension has emerged between the growth of the free labor mentality embodied in the Republican Party in particular, on the one hand, and the expansionist drive of Southern slavery. See, you don't really find him saying slavery and capitalism are incompatible, but the two labor systems are, because, and he particularly identifies the Midwest. And he says there's this growth of immigrant labor from Europe in the Midwest that's abolitionist. And he connects this to the fighting in Kansas. Marx, by the way, was very aware of John Brown and the uprising at Harper's Ferry. He writes about it. He's clear that this is happening. And Marx is essentially saying it's the abolitionism of workers in the North combined with the revolutionary potential of the enslaved people of the South that's the key to the Civil War. And when he talks about there being a revolutionary turn, and he says the revolutionary turn in the Civil War breaks the constitutional history of the United States. It breaks the constitutional history of the United States because the entry of black workers into the Civil War, black men in arms, the creation of the black regiments, all of this breaks the constitutional history of the U.S. because for the first time the North is not genuflecting to the slave power. But of course it's a combination of abolitionists in the North and the insurgency, Du Bois's general strike of the slaves, that breaks that. And so it's a fascinating account, but I don't think he thinks it's a question of two modes of production in that respect. So, you know, it's really a question of what someone like Becker means. Does he have Marx's sense that increasingly workers in the North fear the growth of the slaveocracy? They do not want the spread of slavery because they see their own future being compromised by this. So, Steve, I know we've got a question here, but you direct me if we need to go back here. So, there was a question about the more modern forms of ethno-racial division among workers and to what degree this is a legacy of slavery. And I think the answer is that it is a legacy. And I think it goes right back to Fred's question at the outset, which is that there's a sense in which we need to think, at least in part, about the persistence of racism as one of the afterlives of slavery. And what Marx hadn't thought through adequately is the reconstitution of racial oppressions and divisions without slavery, post-slavery. How they can take on new forms. But it's a sense in which, you know, if you were to really exaggerate the Marx's phrase, it's a way of saying that the global legacy of slavery is still with us, in that racialization became configured with capitalism in new ways. If slavery was foundational to racial capitalism at a certain point, We have a racial capitalism today without chattel slavery. It has forms of bonded labor, as we've been talking about, particularly among precarious migrants. And so then one of the challenges for us is to think about race as one of the key forms of differentiation within working classes. And the fact that this can become deeply embedded in the social fabric without slavery. And I think, no question, Marx underestimated that in Capital, for instance. And that's what I meant earlier by way of saying that this is where anti-racist and anti-colonial Marxisms become so significant in terms of extending and developing our analysis. Because, you know, there's this, Fanon makes this claim in The Wretched of the Earth, that in the colonial context, base and superstructure can reverse position. Now, I think you have to think very dialectically about this, but really what he's saying is racism as a social power can affect the so-called economic base in just the ways that you were describing. The way in which labor gets differentiated within different segments of the labor market, different job categories. And of course, we need to regender in a similar kind of way as a mode or a structure of differentiation within the working class. And so it really, it really means that in ways that are critical to the Marxist agenda today, and I think the work of the Marxist Education Project really, really valuable in this regard, in trying to address these questions of race and gender within late capitalism and within the constitution or composition of working classes. It's a way of acknowledging that we can't do without class analysis, but that classes are not uniformly homogeneous. They're differentiated and heterogeneous. And therefore, the tasks of a working class politics is not just to say unite and fight. It's to figure out the axes of differentiation that have to be struggled over to create transcending solidarities. And those transcending solidarities can't be accomplished without actually digging in at the levels of those differentiations, where you foreground in demands and needs of migrant workers, for instance, of racialized workers, the ways in which women and queer workers have been segmented within labor markets and so on. And so that's a task of politics, of course, but we need the analytical tools to help us do that. And so one of the reasons I went back to the end of Capital is for exactly what I was saying earlier. What if we project forward from Marx and think about colonialism and racism as inherent to globalization and capitalism? By stopping there, Marx doesn't take us into that territory. But I think we all recognize in the world today we have to go there.
So we have
Okay, first of all, I wanted to say thank you so much. This is absolutely incredible. And I just have a small side comment about the issue of breeding slaves and how slaves did try to not breed that much, and how that it actually fed back into Europe in terms of the knowledge production in the 19th century. And that is the knowledge of some of these plants that were used to suppress pregnancy, like the peacock flower, was censored out of the incredible amount of botanical research that was being done at the time. All kinds of new plants that were discovered in the New World were being classified and so on, and that knowledge was brought back to Europe. But the peacock plant itself, which was an abortifacient, was censored out of all that knowledge. I put one small reference of that into the chat for the people who are on Zoom. That's from the Brooklyn Botanical Garden. And there's also a book by Linda Scheibinger called Plants and Empire, Colonial Bioprospecting in the Atlantic World, if anybody is more interested in that question. And then that particular piece of knowledge, which may have been useful to other people, was just completely suppressed until recently. Thank you.
Yes, well, Christine, thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. And one of the things that I think we're really just beginning to explore in a lot of areas is the interaction between indigenous peoples and Black women, through which some of that knowledge of plant and botanical life in the New World was acquired. We know that some enslaved people ran off to indigenous peoples. They escaped slavery by joining with indigenous communities. We know that at a place like Negro Fort, hundreds and hundreds of escaped Africans and particularly Seminole indigenous people lived and held that community together for several years before they were finally defeated. And so I think, what you say is 100% correct, and I also think it's an area in which probably interchange between Black and indigenous peoples becomes quite important in terms of unearthing a kind of, subaltern botanical history that we're only really beginning to know a little bit about. So thank you for that and for the reference. I think there's a lot to be learned here.
Okay, thank you so much, David. This is